It was a cold December morning in Manhattan, and Ethan Grayson's world was as ordered and predictable as the snowflakes blanketing the city streets. His mornings began the same way every day. A perfectly pressed suit, a steaming cup of black coffee, and the silence of his townhouse, interrupted only by the occasional distant giggle from his 5-year-old son, Noah, playing upstairs with the nanny. Ethan didn't hate Christmas, but he didn't embrace it either. Since losing his wife, Sarah, 3 years ago, the holidays had become another reminder of what was missing. The once joyous season had devolved into a time for keeping up appearances, lavish decorations meticulously arranged by a hired team, expensive gifts couriered to clients and friends, and a towering artificial tree that was more ornament than symbol. For Noah, Christmas was something different entirely. The little boy didn't understand his father's detachment from the season. He still believed in the magic of reindeer and the promise of Santa's sleigh. But even Noah's belief in magic couldn't fill the void left by a father too consumed with work to notice the light in his son's eyes growing dimmer with each passing holiday. Ethan's latest distraction was a high-stakes legal case that demanded his complete attention. He'd scheduled meetings even on Christmas Eve, leaving Noah in the care of a sitter. The thought of returning to a clean house after a long day at the office prompted Ethan to hire a cleaning service last minute. That's how Clara Bennett walked into their lives. Clara's world was nothing like Ethan's. Living in a modest shelter for single women, she had seen the best and worst of humanity. The shelter was her lifeline after years of struggling to rebuild herself. A former waitress turned cleaning lady, Clara had spent years scraping by after losing custody of her daughter, Emily. Every penny she earned went toward legal fees, hoping that one day she could be reunited with the child she hadn't seen in nearly 5 years. When Clara accepted the job at Ethan's townhouse, she hadn't expected it to be anything special, just another high-paying gig to help her buy gifts for the children at the shelter. But as she stepped into the grand but sterile living room, she couldn't help but notice the emptiness. It wasn't the lack of dust or clutter, it was the absence of warmth. As she worked, she discovered boxes of forgotten holiday decorations tucked away in a corner of the storage closet. A small smile crept onto her face. Clara had always loved Christmas, even in the worst of times. Her hands moved instinctively, pulling out strings of lights, a wreath, and a bundle of mismatched ornaments. She didn't ask permission. Something inside her said this home needed a little Christmas magic. Noah was the first to notice. Emerging cautiously from his playroom, he peeked into the living room to find Clara stringing lights around the staircase. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice curious but tinged with shyness. Clara turned with a warm smile. "I thought your house could use some Christmas cheer. What do you think?" The little boy's face lit up, and in moments, he was beside her, digging through the boxes and pulling out ornaments with the wide-eyed wonder only a child could muster. Clara's heart softened at his excitement, and she found herself laughing alongside him as they decorated a small, neglected tree she'd found in the corner of the garage. Hours passed like minutes, and by the time the tree was complete, the house no longer felt like the cold, impersonal space it had been that morning. Noah, usually quiet and reserved, was a bundle of energy, singing carols and sharing stories about his favorite Christmas books. Clara listened intently, feeling a connection with the boy that surprised her. She had just finished baking a tray of cookies with Noah when the sound of the front door opening froze them both. Ethan stood in the entryway, his sharp, gray eyes scanning the transformed room. His gaze shifted from the glowing tree to his son, whose face was smeared with flour, and finally to Clara, who stood awkwardly in the kitchen doorway. "What is going on here?" Ethan's voice was calm, but edged with irritation. Noah ran to his father, his excitement overriding his usual shyness. "Dad, look, we made Christmas." Ethan's eyes softened as he knelt to meet his son's gaze. "I see that," he said, his tone less sharp now. "Go wash up, buddy." As Noah bounded upstairs, Ethan straightened, his attention turning to Clara. "I didn't ask for this," he said bluntly. Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "I know, but your son needed it." Ethan was taken aback by her candor. For a moment, he said nothing, his mind wrestling with emotions he didn't want to confront. Finally, he simply nodded, more out of exhaustion than agreement. and turned away. Clara exhaled deeply, unsure if she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But as she looked around at the cozy, festive room, she decided it was worth it. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of disarray as he sat in his study that evening, staring at his laptop. The house no longer felt like his. The carefully curated sterility had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Chaos, yes, but also warmth. He tried to focus on the legal briefs in front of him, but the faint sound of Noah laughing upstairs with the babysitter distracted him. Laughter wasn't something he was accustomed to hearing in his home. It felt foreign, almost invasive. Clara had stayed longer than expected to finish her work, though Ethan suspected she had lingered intentionally. He found her in the kitchen, meticulously scrubbing a tray of cookies she'd baked with Noah. The smell of cinnamon and sugar lingered in the air, mixing with the faint pine scent from the tree. It was, he realized, the first time his house had ever smelled like Christmas. "I should go," Clara said, breaking the silence when she sensed him watching her from the doorway. She didn't apologize for the decorations, though Ethan half expected her to. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made him feel oddly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people like Clara, people who weren't afraid to act without permission, who brought a sense of purpose wherever they went. "You've done enough for today," he said, his tone even but distant. "I'll transfer the payment in the morning." Clara dried her hands on a towel and nodded. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Grayson." Ethan didn't reply. He watched her gather her things and walk toward the door. There was something about her, something unspoken, that lingered in the room even after she left. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of Noah's laughter again. This time, it wasn't the carefree laughter of the previous day, but something more mischievous. He followed the sound downstairs to find his son perched by the tree, rearranging the ornaments Clara had carefully hung. "Dad, look at this one." Noah held up a small, handmade ornament, a snowman crafted from cotton balls. Ethan blinked, realizing it hadn't come from his collection. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "Miss Clara made it for me," Noah said proudly. "She told me she used to make these with her daughter." Ethan froze. Clara had a daughter? The thought hadn't crossed his mind, though now it seemed obvious. Something in the way she'd interacted with Noah, her gentle patience and genuine delight in his excitement, had hinted at a maternal instinct. But why hadn't she mentioned her child? And where was she? Ethan didn't have much time to dwell on it. He had planned another full day of work, but Noah's insistence that he come see the rest of the tree's new decorations forced him to sit down in the living room. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the weight of his son's disappointment. He saw it in the way Noah's face fell when Ethan reached for his laptop instead of a storybook. He heard it in the half-hearted answers Noah gave to his questions. Guilt gnawed at him. Later that day, he found himself scrolling through the cleaning service's contact information. He hesitated, his finger hovering over Clara's number. He didn't know why he was so compelled to call her, but something about her presence had stuck with him. When he finally pressed the button, his heart raced slightly as the phone rang. "Mr. Grayson," Clara answered, her voice calm but surprised. "I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday," Ethan began awkwardly. "Noah hasn't been that animated in a long time." "I'm glad he enjoyed it," Clara said simply. There was a pause. Ethan wasn't sure how to continue without sounding intrusive. "Noah mentioned you have a daughter." Clara's breath caught audibly on the other end of the line. "I do," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "But I haven't seen her in years." Ethan frowned, sensing the pain in her words. "Why not?" Clara hesitated, then said, "It's a long story, Mr. Grayson. One I don't think you'd be interested in." He surprised himself by replying, "I think I would." The line went silent for a moment before Clara finally spoke. She told him about Emily, how she'd raised her alone after her ex-husband walked out, how life had unraveled when she lost her job, how a mistake during her lowest point had cost her custody of her child. She spoke with a detached resolve, as though she'd long accepted her pain as part of her life. Ethan listened without interrupting, his chest tightening as he realized how much Clara had endured. When she finished, he said, "You shouldn't have to go through that alone." Clara's laugh was soft but bitter. I've been on my own for a long time, Mr. Grayson. It's just how life works sometimes. Ethan didn't know what possessed him, but the words came out before he could stop them. Let me help you. There was another pause, longer this time. Why would you do that? Clara asked, her tone skeptical. Because it's Christmas, Ethan said, though he knew that wasn't the real reason. Something about Clara had struck a chord in him, awakened a part of himself he thought had died with Sarah. And because I think you deserve it. Clara didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. Thank you. But I've learned not to expect miracles. After the call ended, Ethan sat in silence for a long time. He couldn't shake the image of Clara's face as she left his house, worn but resolute, as though she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders but refused to let it crush her. He didn't know how, but he was determined to lighten that burden. That evening, he began making calls. If Clara wasn't going to believe in miracles, then Ethan would create one for her. Ethan spent the evening sifting through contacts, making calls to colleagues and acquaintances, pulling every string he could think of. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt so compelled to help Clara, but the determination grew stronger with each conversation. Maybe it was guilt, or perhaps a deep-seated need to reconnect with something he had lost, the humanity buried beneath years of carefully built walls. By the time he closed his laptop, it was past midnight. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the heater and the soft rustle of the wind against the windows. He stood in the doorway of Noah's room, watching his son sleep peacefully, clutching the small snowman ornament Clara had given him. A pang of emotion hit him unexpectedly. He thought about all the moments he'd missed with Noah, moments Clara had somehow managed to unlock in a single day. It unsettled him how much of an impact she had already made. The next morning, Ethan decided to take a rare day off from work. Noah's surprise was evident as he came downstairs to find his father sitting at the breakfast table, drinking coffee. For once, Ethan wasn't dressed in a suit, and the absence of his laptop was noticeable. "Dad, are you not going to work today?" Noah asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Ethan shook his head. "Not today, buddy. I thought we could spend some time together." Noah's face lit up, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt for how little his son had come to expect from him. He vowed silently to change that. As they ate breakfast together, Ethan found himself thinking about Clara again. Her story lingered in his mind, and with it came a growing sense of urgency. He needed to do more than just listen. He needed to act. After breakfast, Ethan bundled Noah up and took him out to pick up a few things for the house. They stopped at a small Christmas market downtown, where vendors sold handmade ornaments, fresh wreaths, and hot cocoa. Noah's excitement was infectious, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of the holiday spirit he thought he'd lost. "Can we get this one, Dad?" Noah asked, holding up a delicate glass angel ornament. Ethan nodded, handing a few bills to the vendor. He couldn't help but think of Clara and her daughter, wondering if Emily was somewhere out there wishing for a Christmas miracle of her own. Later that day, Ethan made another call to Clara. When she answered, her tone was cautious but polite. "Mr. Grayson, is everything all right? I wanted to see if you'd come by the house later," he said. "I'd like to talk to you about something." Clara hesitated, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might decline. But finally, she said, "All right, I can be there this evening." When Clara arrived, the house was different again. The tree she had helped decorate was now adorned with the glass angel ornament Noah had picked out, and there was a warmth to the space that hadn't been there before. Clara noticed it immediately, but didn't comment. Ethan greeted her at the door, his expression serious but not unkind. "Thank you for coming," he said. He led her to the living room, where Noah was happily playing with a small wooden train set by the tree. Clara smiled softly at the sight of him. "You've got a good kid," she said. "I know," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with regret. "And I owe you for reminding me of that." She gave him a curious look but said nothing, waiting for him to explain. Ethan gestured for her to sit, and as she did, he took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you told me, the situation with your daughter." Clara stiffened slightly, the protective walls she had built over the years rising instinctively. "Mr. Grayson, I appreciate your concern, but..." "Please," Ethan interrupted gently. "Just hear me out." She nodded, reluctantly. Ethan leaned forward, his tone earnest. I can help you, Clara. I have connections. People who can help you navigate the legal system, track down where Emily is, and make a case for why she should be back with you. Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as though she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Why would you do that for me? She asked softly. Because I can, Ethan said simply. And because I think everyone deserves a second chance. You've done more for Noah in one day than I've managed in years. Helping you is the least I can do. Clara blinked, tears welling up in her eyes despite her best efforts to remain composed. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me help, Ethan replied. I can't promise miracles, but I can promise I'll do everything I can. Clara nodded slowly, her voice trembling. Okay. Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into the task with the same intensity he reserved for his most important cases. He called in favors, tracked down records, and even met with one of his old colleagues who specialized in family law. Clara, initially hesitant, found herself overwhelmed by the effort Ethan was putting into her case. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Noah, sensing the change in his father, seemed happier too. He began spending more time with Ethan, asking questions about his work and sharing stories about the decorations Clara had taught him to make. The house, once silent and cold, was now filled with life. As Christmas Eve approached, Ethan received a call from one of his contacts. The news was better than he had expected. Emily had been located, and her current guardians were open to arranging a meeting. Ethan relayed the information to Clara, who was overcome with emotion. She could hardly believe it was real. Are you sure this is happening? She asked, her voice shaking. It's happening, Ethan said firmly. We'll see her tomorrow. Clara's tears flowed freely as she thanked him, the weight of years of heartbreak beginning to lift. Ethan watched her, feeling something stir inside him, a sense of purpose, of connection. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something greater than himself. And for the first time, he began to believe in Christmas miracles too. Christmas Eve arrived with a heavy stillness in the air, the kind that always seemed to precede a snowfall. Ethan stood by the window in his study, staring out at the city blanketed in white. His mind was racing with thoughts about the meeting he had arranged for Clara. In his world, things were often complicated, messy, and wrapped in legal formalities. But this was something different. This was about repairing something broken, something personal. Downstairs, Noah was bouncing with excitement, his small hands carefully arranging cookies on a plate for Santa. Clara sat beside him, helping him sort through a mix of sprinkles and frosting. She wore a simple sweater that was slightly too large for her, but her smile was warm, and her movements gentle as she guided Noah's eager hands. Ethan walked in quietly, pausing in the doorway to watch them. The sight filled him with a strange, unfamiliar warmth, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that Noah was happy. It was the way Clara's presence seemed to transform the house into a home. Dad, look, Noah called out, breaking his thoughts. We made reindeer cookies. Miss Clara said Santa loves these. Ethan smiled faintly. I'm sure he does. Clara glanced at Ethan, her expression soft but searching. She had felt a change in him over the past few days. The sharp edges of his demeanor seemed to have softened, replaced by something gentler. She could see it in the way he interacted with Noah, in the effort he was making to create memories that mattered. Are you ready for later? Ethan asked her quietly, motioning toward the hallway. Clara nodded, though there was a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. I think so, she said softly. Noah tugged at her sleeve, oblivious to the gravity of their conversation. Miss Clara, will you come back tomorrow for Christmas? He asked eagerly. We can open presents and play with my train. Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting to Ethan. He met her eyes and gave a small nod, his voice steady. You're welcome here, Clara. Both of you. Her throat tightened at the offer. She managed to smile for Noah's sake. I'd love that, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove Clara across town to a modest suburban neighborhood. The snow had started falling in earnest, and the roads were quiet. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent the past several years trying to suppress the hope that one day she might see her daughter again. Now that it was within reach, the fear of what might happen was almost paralyzing. What if she doesn't recognize me? Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, his voice calm but firm. She'll know. You're her mother. Clara nodded, though doubt lingered in her expression. She looked out the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the snow blur the world outside. She had spent so many nights imagining this moment, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. When they arrived, Ethan parked the car and turned to her. You don't have to do this alone, he said gently. I'll be here. Clara swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. They walked up the short pathway to the house, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. A middle-aged woman opened the door, her expression kind but guarded. She introduced herself as Emily's guardian and invited them inside. Clara's breath caught as she stepped into the warm, cozy living room. Her eyes immediately found the girl sitting on the floor, reading a book. Emily. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Emily was taller now, her features more defined, but her eyes were the same, a deep, familiar shade of brown that mirrored Clara's own. The girl looked up, sensing the presence of strangers, and her gaze locked with Clara's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Clara's hands trembled as she took a tentative step forward. Hi, sweetheart, she said, her voice breaking. It's me. It's Mom. Emily's eyes widened, her book slipping from her hands. Mom, she said softly, as though testing the word. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she nodded. I've missed you so much. Emily stood slowly, her movements cautious but curious. Then, in an instant, she crossed the room and threw her arms around Clara. The force of the hug nearly knocked Clara off balance, but she didn't care. She held her daughter tightly, sobbing into her hair as years of longing and regret melted away. Ethan stood to the side, giving them space but unable to look away. He felt an unexpected lump in his throat as he watched the reunion unfold. It was raw and unfiltered, a moment so profoundly human that it made everything else in the world seem small by comparison. The guardian cleared her throat gently, stepping closer to Ethan. She's been asking about her mother for years, she said quietly. I think this is what she's been waiting for. Ethan nodded, his voice low. It's what they both needed. The rest of the visit passed in a blur of conversation and cautious optimism. Clara and Emily spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of lost time. Ethan sat back, observing the way Clara's face lit up when Emily smiled, the way her hands hovered protectively near her daughter's, as though afraid she might disappear again. When it was time to leave, Emily hugged Clara tightly. Will I see you again soon? She asked, her voice trembling. Clara's tears returned as she promised, Yes, sweetheart. I'll be here. Always. As Ethan drove Clara home that evening, the car was filled with a quiet sense of triumph. The weight Clara had carried for so long seemed lighter now, and though the road ahead was uncertain, the first step had been taken. Thank you, Clara said softly, breaking the silence. For everything. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You don't have to thank me, he said. It was the right thing to do. Clara nodded, her heart full for the first time in years. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, unbroken white. A canvas for new beginnings. The drive back to Ethan's house was quiet, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Clara stared out the window at the falling snow, her mind replaying every moment of her reunion with Emily. She clutched the small scarf Emily had left in her hands, unwilling to let go of even the smallest piece of her daughter. A smile lingered on her face, though her eyes were red from tears. For the first time in years, she felt hope blooming in her chest. Ethan glanced at her as he drove, sensing the shift in her demeanor. She looked lighter somehow, as though the years of pain and longing had begun to ease their grip. It struck him how transformative a single moment could be. A reunion, a conversation, an embrace. And he realized how much he'd underestimated the power of connection. He thought of Noah and silently vowed to be better, to be more present, to never let his son feel the kind of longing Clara had carried for so long. When they arrived at the house, Clara hesitated before stepping out of the car. "Are you sure it's okay for me to stay tonight? I don't want to impose." Ethan gave her a firm but gentle look. "You're not imposing. And besides, Noah would be heartbroken if you weren't here tomorrow." Clara laughed softly, her breath visible in the cold air. "All right, thank you." Inside, the house was warm and inviting, the scent of pine and cinnamon still hanging in the air. Noah came bounding down the stairs as soon as he heard the door open, his face lighting up when he saw Clara. "Miss Clara, did you see Santa yet? Did he say if he's coming tonight?" Clara knelt down, smiling as she shook her head. "Not yet, but I think he's on his way. You've been extra good this year, haven't you?" Noah nodded enthusiastically, then grabbed her hand. "Come look at the cookies. I made a new one for Santa. It's shaped like a train." Ethan watched as his son led Clara into the kitchen, his heart tightening at the sight. He had always believed his home was complete, organized, efficient, and devoid of unnecessary complications. But now, he saw how empty it had been. Clara's presence had brought something intangible but undeniable: life. Later that evening, after Noah was tucked into bed, Ethan and Clara sat by the fireplace, the glow of the flames casting warm light across the room. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, its handmade ornaments a reminder of the day Clara had unknowingly changed everything. "You've done so much for me," Clara said softly, breaking the silence. "I don't even know how to thank you." Ethan shook his head. "You don't have to. Helping you. It's been as much for me as it's been for you." Clara tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared into the fire. "For a long time, I've been stuck. After Sarah died, I threw myself into work because it was easier than dealing with everything I'd lost. But in doing that, I lost other things too. Moments with Noah, the chance to be the kind of father he needs." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Then you came along, and in one day, you reminded me what it means to feel connected again. To care about something beyond my own world." Clara listened intently, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "I know what it's like to close yourself off, to think that if you don't let anyone in, you won't get hurt. But life doesn't work that way. The walls we build, they don't protect us. They just keep the good things out." Ethan looked at her, struck by the weight of her words. "You're right," he admitted. "I just wish I'd realized it sooner." Clara gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's never too late to change. You've already started." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a peaceful stillness. Ethan found himself glancing at Clara again, noticing the way the firelight danced in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. He realized how much he admired her, not just for her resilience, but for her ability to bring light into even the darkest places. "Tomorrow will be busy," he said finally, his voice lighter now. "Noah's been counting down the minutes to Christmas morning." Clara laughed softly. "I can imagine. He's a special kid." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "He is. And I've been so focused on work that I've missed a lot of what makes him special. I don't want to make that mistake again." "You won't," Clara said firmly. "You're here now. That's what matters." Her words stayed with Ethan long after she'd gone to bed. He sat alone in the quiet living room, staring at the Christmas tree and thinking about everything that had changed in the past few days. For so long, he had viewed Christmas as just another obligation, another performance to get through. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. When Christmas morning arrived, the house was alive with the sounds of laughter and excitement. Noah tore through his presents with the uncontainable joy of a child, showing each one to Clara as though she were the most important audience in the world. Ethan watched from the couch, his heart full as he saw the light in his son's eyes, the same light he had thought might be gone forever. As the morning unfolded, Clara received a surprise of her own. Ethan handed her a small, neatly wrapped box. She looked at him, puzzled. "What's this?" "Open it," he said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Inside the box was a set of keys. Clara stared at them, then at Ethan, her confusion evident. "What are these for?" "For a new beginning," he said simply. "There's an apartment nearby. It's yours if you want it. A place for you and Emily to start fresh." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, speechless. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take it," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You deserve it. And so does Emily." Clara nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you for everything." Ethan smiled, feeling something shift within him. This Christmas wasn't about grand gestures or extravagant gifts. It was about finding connection, rediscovering hope, and creating a foundation for a brighter future. And in that moment, as Clara hugged him tightly and Noah laughed beside them, Ethan finally understood what it meant to truly celebrate Christmas. The rest of Christmas morning unfolded like a dream, a series of simple but perfect moments that etched themselves deeply into Clara's heart. She sat on the plush rug in front of the Christmas tree with Noah, helping him assemble a small train set he'd unwrapped just moments earlier. His laughter rang through the room, pure and unguarded, and it felt like music to her ears. For years, she had associated Christmas with longing, yearning for her daughter, mourning what she'd lost, and carrying the burden of unfulfilled hope. But here, in this warm, lively room, she felt something shift. She wasn't sure if it was joy or gratitude, or simply the realization that maybe, just maybe, life was beginning to offer her a second chance. Ethan sat back on the couch, sipping coffee and watching them. He couldn't remember the last time his house had felt like this, so full of life and love. Noah had come alive in a way that Ethan hadn't seen in years, and it was all thanks to Clara. Her warmth, her patience, her natural ability to connect with his son. It had transformed everything. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to feel content, to live in the moment rather than constantly planning for the next one. Clara glanced up from the train tracks, catching Ethan's eye. She smiled softly, and he returned it, a small but meaningful gesture of mutual understanding. She was grateful for what he'd done, not just for her but for Noah too. And Ethan was grateful for her, for bringing a light into his home that he hadn't realized was missing. After the gifts were unwrapped and the remnants of wrapping paper cleared away, Clara helped Noah into his coat and boots. He was eager to play outside in the fresh snow, and Ethan had suggested a trip to the nearby park. Clara wasn't sure if she should join them. This wasn't her family, after all, but when Noah grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door, she didn't have the heart to say no. Ethan, too, seemed pleased, holding the door open for them and stepping out into the crisp, snow-covered morning. The park was alive with the sounds of families enjoying the holiday. Children ran through the snow, pulling sleds or throwing snowballs, while parents laughed and called out warnings to watch for icy patches. Ethan and Clara walked side by side as Noah ran ahead, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. He stopped occasionally to scoop up handfuls of snow, laughing as he tossed them in the air and let the flakes drift back onto his coat. For a while, Ethan and Clara walked in companionable silence, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Then Ethan spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You know, when I first hired you, I didn't think much about it. It was just another task to check off my list." Clara smiled wryly, glancing at him. "And now?" "Now," he said, pausing for a moment to choose his words, "I can't imagine what this Christmas would have been like without you. You've done more than clean my house, Clara. You've given it life." Her cheeks flushed, not from the cold but from his words. She looked away, watching Noah as he knelt in the snow to shape a small mound into what appeared to be the beginnings of a snowman. "I think your house already had life," she said quietly. "It just needed a little help finding it again." Ethan smiled at her response, appreciating her humility. "Well, whatever it is, I'm grateful." They reached a bench near the park's edge and sat down, watching as Noah worked diligently on his snowman. Clara felt a strange but welcome sense of peace settle over her. It was rare for her to sit still and enjoy the moment. Her life had been so full of worry and struggle that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to simply be present. Have you thought about what you'll do next? Ethan asked after a while, breaking the silence. Clara hesitated, her hands resting in her lap. I'm not sure. It's hard to think too far ahead. For so long, I've just been trying to get by. But now, with Emily back in my life and the apartment you've offered me, I think I finally have the chance to start over. You deserve that chance, Ethan said firmly. And so does Emily. Clara turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Why did you do it? She asked softly. All of this, helping me, giving me a place to live. Why? Ethan held her gaze, his expression open and honest. Because I've been given second chances too. And because I've seen what you've done for Noah, the way you've brought out a side of him I thought I'd lost. I can't change the past, Clara, but I can try to make the future better. For you, for Emily, and for my son. Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly blinked them away. She wasn't used to kindness like this, to people going out of their way to help her without expecting something in return. It both humbled and overwhelmed her. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan simply nodded, and they turned their attention back to Noah, who was now calling them over to inspect his snowman. They laughed as they joined him, offering suggestions and helping him pack the snow more tightly. The morning passed in a flurry of snowball fights, laughter, and the simple joy of being together. When they returned to the house, their cheeks were rosy, and their boots tracked snow onto the mat by the door. Clara helped Noah out of his coat while Ethan went to start a pot of hot cocoa. As they settled into the living room with steaming mugs in hand, Clara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. She knew this wasn't her home, that her life was still in flux, but for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe she could find a place like this. A place where she and Emily could build new traditions and create the kind of warmth she had felt here. Noah climbed onto the couch beside Clara, his head resting against her arm as his eyes began to droop. She stroked his hair gently, her heart full as she glanced at Ethan, who was watching the two of them with a soft smile. Thank you for letting me be part of this, she said quietly, not wanting to disturb Noah. For sharing your family with me. Ethan shook his head. You've given just as much as you've received, Clara. If anything, I should be thanking you. They sat there in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth and the scent of pine filling the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, everything felt warm, safe, and whole. As the day turned to evening, the promise of a new beginning hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. For Clara, Ethan, and Noah, this Christmas had become more than just a holiday. It was a turning point, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. And for the first time in a long while, they all believed in the possibility of something better. The days following Christmas passed in a kind of quiet harmony that neither Clara nor Ethan had expected. The house had taken on a life of its own, filled with warmth, laughter, and the subtle, comforting noise of people simply being together. Clara had stayed longer than planned, at Ethan's insistence, and while she had initially felt like an intruder in his world, that feeling quickly faded. The walls she'd built over the years began to lower, and for the first time in ages, she let herself feel at home. Ethan, for his part, found himself enjoying the simplicity of these moments. He watched as Clara moved around the house with an ease that felt natural, whether it was reading to Noah, tidying up a stray pile of toys, or standing at the kitchen counter making tea. He realized how different life could be when the space around him wasn't just a house, but a home filled with care and connection. Noah was thriving. The little boy who had once been quiet and reserved now radiated energy and joy. He clung to Clara with an affection that was both sweet and heartbreaking, as though he sensed the maternal warmth she carried and wanted to hold on to it. Ethan saw it too and was grateful, though it stirred feelings he hadn't yet fully processed. Clara had brought something into their lives that he hadn't even known they were missing. One evening, as the snow continued to fall outside, the three of them gathered in the living room. Noah was building a fort out of pillows and blankets, his face alight with concentration. Clara and Ethan sat on the couch, sipping tea, their conversation easy and unhurried. Emily called me today, Clara said after a moment, her voice soft but filled with quiet excitement. She wants to visit the new apartment next week. I told her about it, and she sounded so happy. Ethan smiled. That's great, Clara. How are you feeling about it? Nervous, she admitted. It still feels so fragile, like one wrong move could ruin everything. But I'm hopeful. More hopeful than I've been in a long time. You should be, Ethan said, his tone reassuring. You fought for this, and you deserve it. Emily does too. Clara looked down at her mug, her fingers tracing the rim. I keep thinking about how much I almost gave up. There were so many moments when it felt impossible, when I thought I'd never see her again. And now, it's like everything's changing so fast. In a good way, but it's still overwhelming. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Change is hard, even when it's good. But you're not alone in this anymore. Clara met his eyes, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the unspoken weight of their shared experiences filling the space between them. She was about to respond when Noah's voice interrupted, pulling their attention. Come look at my fort, he called, beaming with pride. They both laughed and got up to inspect his creation, crouching down to admire the intricate structure of blankets and cushions. Noah explained each room with the seriousness of an architect, his excitement contagious. As they played along, Clara felt a pang of longing for Emily, wishing her daughter could be there to share in the moment. But she also felt a sense of gratitude for Noah, for Ethan, and for the strange, unexpected way their lives had become intertwined. The next day, Clara began packing her things. The apartment Ethan had arranged for her was ready, and while she was excited about the new beginning it represented, leaving the Grayson home felt bittersweet. It wasn't just about the comfort of the house. It was about the connections she had formed within its walls. She had grown fond of Noah's infectious laughter and Ethan's quiet kindness, and the thought of leaving it all behind filled her with an ache she hadn't anticipated. Ethan noticed her hesitation as she folded her clothes into a small suitcase. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching her with a thoughtful expression. You don't have to rush, you know, he said. The apartment will be there when you're ready. Clara smiled faintly, shaking her head. You've already done so much for me, Ethan. I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not, he said simply, but I understand if you're ready to move on. Just know that you always have a place here. Her heart swelled at his words, but she didn't know how to respond. Instead, she nodded, focusing on her packing to steady herself. The move happened quietly, without fanfare, but with a sense of hope that lingered in the air. Ethan helped her load the few belongings she had into his car, and Noah insisted on carrying a small box of her books, his determination bringing a smile to both their faces. As they drove to the apartment, Clara felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, excitement, and a deep sense of gratitude. When they arrived, the apartment was exactly as Ethan had described, modest but warm, with plenty of sunlight streaming through the windows. Clara stood in the empty living room, taking it all in. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a place where she could begin to rebuild her life with Emily. This is perfect, she said softly, turning to Ethan. I'm glad you think so, he replied. You deserve it. They spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, and by evening, the apartment began to feel like home. Clara placed a small photo of Emily on the mantel, her fingers lingering on the frame. It was a reminder of everything she had fought for and everything she still hoped to achieve. As Ethan and Noah prepared to leave, Clara knelt down to hug the little boy tightly. Thank you for helping me, Noah, she said, her voice filled with affection. You're the best helper I've ever had. Noah grinned, his arms wrapped around her neck. You'll come visit, right? You promised. I promise, Clara said, her eyes glistening. And you'll visit me too, okay? He nodded, satisfied with the arrangement. Ethan watched the exchange, his heart tugged by the bond that had formed between them. When Clara stood, she turned to him, her expression serious but full of gratitude. Ethan, she began, her voice steady. I don't think I can ever thank you enough for everything you've done for me. For Emily. You don't have to, he said, his tone soft. Just be happy, Clara. That's all I want. As they said their goodbyes, Clara watched from the window as Ethan and Noah walked back to the car. She felt a strange sense of loss as the car pulled away, but it was tempered by the hope that this wasn't the end of their connection. It was simply the beginning of something new. Back at the Grayson home, Ethan put Noah to bed, lingering for a moment to watch his son sleep. He thought about Clara and the changes she had brought into their lives. It wasn't just her presence. It was the way she had reminded him of the importance of connection, of letting people in. And as he sat in the quiet living room that night, he realized that his own journey wasn't over yet. There were still things he needed to confront, changes he needed to make. But for the first time, he felt ready. Ready to face the future, to embrace the unexpected, and to believe that even in the hardest times, there was always a chance for something good to grow. The warmth of spring gradually gave way to summer, and with it came a flurry of new beginnings for both Clara and Ethan. Emily had settled comfortably into her new routine, and her bond with Noah had only deepened. The two of them spent hours playing in the park, riding their bikes through the neighborhood, or inventing elaborate games that left Clara and Ethan exchanging amused glances. The sound of their laughter had become a constant presence, a joyful reminder of how far they had all come. Clara's days were full but fulfilling. She had taken on a part-time job at a local community center, running workshops for other single parents who were navigating challenges similar to the ones she had faced. It wasn't just work. It was a way for her to give back, to share the lessons she had learned and offer hope to those who felt as lost as she once had. Seeing the impact she could have on others filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Ethan, too, was embracing change. He had made a conscious effort to spend more time with Noah, stepping away from the demanding grind of his career to focus on what truly mattered. The shift hadn't been easy. His work had long been his identity, but as he watched his son thrive, he knew it was the right choice. He found himself looking forward to the weekends when he could join Noah and Emily on their adventures or share quiet evenings with Clara, their conversations stretching late into the night. One such evening, they found themselves sitting on Clara's balcony, the soft hum of the city below blending with the occasional chirp of sparrows returning to the birdhouse. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the stars were just beginning to peek through the twilight. Clara poured them each a cup of tea, her movements slow and unhurried. "Emily's excited about starting summer camp next week," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "She's been packing and repacking her bag for days." Ethan chuckled, taking a sip of his tea. "Noah's been talking about it nonstop. He keeps asking if they'll be in the same group." "I think they will," Clara replied. "They're going to love it." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that had become familiar between them. Clara glanced at Ethan, studying his profile as he gazed out at the city. She thought about how much he had changed since she first met him. The sharp edges of his demeanor had softened, replaced by a quiet warmth that she hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. "You've been different lately," she said, her tone light but sincere. Ethan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter," she said thoughtfully. "Happier. Like you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders anymore." He considered her words, nodding slowly. "I think you're right," he admitted. "For a long time, I was so focused on what I thought I needed to do, building my career, providing for Noah, that I forgot why I was doing it in the first place. But you reminded me of what really matters." Clara felt her cheeks warm at his words, but she didn't look away. "I think we reminded each other." Ethan smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Maybe we did." The summer days passed quickly, filled with activity and connection. Emily and Noah thrived at camp, returning home each day with stories of their adventures and new friends. Clara continued her work at the community center, where she had become a source of inspiration for so many. Ethan, meanwhile, found a renewed sense of purpose in balancing his work with his life at home. It wasn't always easy, but it was fulfilling in a way he hadn't experienced before. One afternoon, Ethan surprised Clara by showing up at the community center during one of her workshops. He stood at the back of the room, watching as she spoke to a group of parents, her voice steady and filled with compassion. He saw the way the room responded to her, the way her words brought comfort and hope. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before, and it deepened his admiration for her even further. After the workshop ended, Clara spotted him and walked over, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you in action," he said, smiling. "You're incredible, Clara. You're making a real difference." Her cheeks flushed, but her smile was genuine. "Thank you. That means a lot." They left the center together, walking slowly through the neighborhood as the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the streets. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking, his tone thoughtful. "You know, when you first walked into my house that day, I never imagined how much you'd change my life." Clara looked at him, her expression soft. "I think we both needed a little change." "I think we did," he agreed. "And I'm glad it was you." As they walked, Clara felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over her. For so long, she had been focused on survival, on putting one foot in front of the other without daring to look too far ahead. But now, for the first time, she could see a future filled with love, hope, and the kind of connections that made life worth living. When they reached her apartment, Ethan paused at the door, his eyes searching hers. "Clara," he said quietly, "I know this wasn't how either of us planned things, but I think this is how it was meant to be." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability that he was allowing himself to show, and it touched her deeply. "I think so too," she said softly. They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading into the background. And in that moment, Clara knew that her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined, but in ways she would never want to undo. Together, they had found something rare and precious, a second chance, and together, they would see where that chance would take them. The crisp autumn air was filled with the scent of falling leaves, the faint hum of the city carrying up to Clara's balcony as she stepped outside, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. The sun had long since set, leaving the skyline illuminated by thousands of tiny lights. The birdhouse that Noah had painted, now weathered and softened by time, swayed slightly in the evening breeze. Clara leaned against the railing, her thoughts drifting to the past year and the unexpected path her life had taken. Everything felt different now, lighter, warmer, and full of possibilities she hadn't dared to hope for before. The laughter that often filled her apartment, the shared dinners with Ethan and the kids, the quiet moments of reflection. They were all pieces of a life she had thought was out of reach. But somehow, against all odds, it had become hers. Her phone buzzed on the table inside, the vibration breaking her reverie. She walked back into the warmth of her apartment, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table as she picked up the phone. The message was from Ethan, accompanied by a photo of Noah grinning widely, holding a pile of colorful leaves nearly as big as he was. Clara chuckled, her heart swelling with affection as she typed a reply. Asterisk, "That's the best leaf pile I've ever seen. Tell him I'm impressed." Asterisk. Moments later, another message came through. Asterisk, "We're finishing up at the park. Are you home?" Asterisk. Clara smiled as she typed back. Asterisk, "I am. Come by if you'd like. I'll put on some tea." Asterisk. Barely 20 minutes had passed before there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, a bakery box balanced in one hand and his familiar, slightly crooked smile greeting her. His jacket carried the faint chill of the evening air, and his cheeks were flushed from the walk. "I brought pie," he announced, holding up the box like a peace offering. "Figured it'd go well with tea." Clara laughed softly, stepping aside to let him in. "You're always welcome here, with or without pie. But pie is definitely a bonus." The aroma of spiced apple pie filled the small kitchen as Clara set the box on the counter and pulled down plates. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her with an ease that felt natural now. Their friendship, if it could even be called that anymore, had grown into something deeper, something they both understood without needing to define it. As they sat down at the kitchen table, the pie warm and fragrant between them, the conversation began to flow as easily as it always did. They talked about the kids, about work, and about the simple joys that had filled their lives in recent months. Clara shared stories from her workshops at the community center, her eyes lighting up as she described the parents she had been helping. Ethan listened intently, his admiration for her growing with every word. "You're doing amazing things," he said sincerely, setting his fork down. I hope you know that. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she smiled. I don't know about amazing, but it feels good to give back, to help people the way others helped me when I needed it. Ethan shook his head, his expression thoughtful. It's more than that. You're changing lives, Clara. You changed mine. His words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She met his gaze, the intensity of it stirring something deep within her. Ethan, you've done just as much for me. More, even. You gave me a chance when I didn't think I deserved one. You did deserve it, he said firmly. You always did. And you've proven that every day since. The warmth in his voice, the certainty in his words, filled Clara with a quiet sense of pride she rarely allowed herself to feel. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. Thank you. For believing in me. For everything. Ethan held her gaze, his voice soft but steady. It's not just about believing in you, Clara. It's about wanting to be part of this. Your life, Emily's life. The life we've built together. Her breath caught, and she felt the familiar ache of emotions welling up. She had been afraid to name what they had, afraid to let herself believe it could last. But in this moment, with Ethan sitting across from her, his hand steady and sure in hers, the fear began to melt away. I want that too, she said quietly, her voice filled with a raw honesty that surprised even her. More than anything, they sat there for a moment, the air between them charged with an unspoken understanding. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, a soft reminder of the world beyond their small, shared space. But here, in this moment, nothing else mattered. After finishing their pie, they moved to the living room, where the conversation turned lighter, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. The warmth of the evening stretched on, the connection between them deepening with every passing moment. Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, a certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. When it was time for Ethan to leave, Clara walked him to the door. He lingered for a moment, his hand brushing hers as he turned to face her. Good night, Clara, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he didn't say. Good night, Ethan, she replied, her smile warm and full of promise. As the door closed behind him, Clara leaned against it, her heart racing. She thought about everything he had said, about the way her life had changed since the day she had stepped into his house. What had started as a simple job had become so much more. A lifeline, a new beginning, and, most unexpectedly, a love that felt steady and true. Later, as she stood on the balcony once more, the cool night air brushing against her skin, she looked out at the city with a sense of quiet wonder. The birdhouse swayed gently in the breeze, its colors faded, but its purpose unchanged. It was a symbol of everything they had built together. Simple, imperfect, and full of life. Clara closed her eyes, letting the peace of the evening wash over her. For the first time in years, the future felt not only possible but bright, filled with the promise of love, connection, and a happiness she had almost forgotten how to dream of. The following Christmas Eve, the Grayson and Bennett families gathered in the cozy warmth of Clara's apartment, a space that had become a second home to them all. The modest living room was alive with the glow of soft string lights, a crackling fire in the hearth, and the sound of laughter spilling out into the hallway. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of baked cookies cooling on the kitchen counter. Emily and Noah were huddled together near the Christmas tree, which stood proudly in the corner, adorned with an eclectic mix of ornaments, some new, some handmade, and others carried over from the past. The two children were busy debating the best placement for a star-shaped topper, their chatter punctuated by giggles as they worked together to secure it. The tree was as much a testament to their growing friendship as it was a centerpiece of the room, its bright colors and mismatched decorations reflecting the joy they had brought into each other's lives. Clara stood in the kitchen, carefully pouring steaming mugs of cocoa and sneaking a quiet moment to take it all in. Her heart swelled as she watched the scene unfold. Emily's easy laughter, Noah's excited movements, and the way Ethan moved effortlessly between them, helping with the tree one moment and teasing the kids the next. It was a snapshot of a life she had once only dreamed of, a life full of love, connection, and the kind of quiet magic she had thought was reserved for other people. Ethan caught her eye and smiled, a soft, knowing look that sent warmth radiating through her chest. He crossed the room and leaned against the counter beside her, his arm brushing hers as he reached for a mug. "You've outdone yourself," he said, nodding toward the tree and the cozy atmosphere she had created. "It wasn't just me," Clara replied with a smile, handing him one of the mugs. "You've had a hand in all of this, too." Ethan took a sip of the cocoa, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's amazing how far we've come, isn't it?" Clara nodded, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "Sometimes it feels like a dream, but then I look around, and it's all so real. Better than I ever imagined." Ethan set his mug down and reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "That's because we built it together," he said softly. "And there's so much more ahead." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she smiled through it. "There is, isn't there?" Their moment was interrupted by Noah's excited call from across the room. "Mom, Dad, come see the tree. We finished it." The title caught Clara off guard, not because it didn't feel right, but because it did. It was the first time Noah had referred to her that way, and the sound of it filled her with a joy she hadn't expected. Ethan gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his own smile growing as they walked over to join the kids. The tree was, in a word, perfect. The star atop it tilted slightly, and some of the ornaments hung unevenly, but that only made it more beautiful. It was a tree that told a story, one of love and growth and the kind of messy, wonderful togetherness that Clara had come to cherish. "It's the best tree ever," Emily declared, her hands on her hips as she admired their work. "I think so too," Ethan said, kneeling to get a closer look. "You two did a fantastic job." Noah beamed, his face lighting up with pride. "Do you think Santa will like it?" Clara knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I think Santa will love it. How could he not?" They spent the rest of the evening sharing stories, playing games, and making new memories. Clara felt the weight of the past lift a little more with every laugh, every smile, and every small moment of connection. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the fear and uncertainty she had carried for so long, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she now had. Later, after the kids had been tucked into bed and the apartment had grown quiet, Clara and Ethan sat together on the couch. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft, flickering light across the room. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the city in a peaceful hush. Ethan turned to her, his hand resting on hers. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about something. About us." Her heart quickened, but she met his gaze, her own steady. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his thumb brushing against the back of her hand. "This past year has been more than I ever could have hoped for. You and Emily, you've become such an important part of my life, of Noah's life. And I don't want that to ever change." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes as she realized what he was saying, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket of warmth. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "I want us to be a family," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Not just in name, but in every way. Will you marry me?" Clara felt the tears spill over, her heart so full it ached. She nodded, her voice barely audible as she said, "Yes, of course yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close as the snow continued to fall outside. In that moment, surrounded by the love they had built together, Clara knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, joy, and the unshakable bonds of family. As the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, Clara and Ethan sat together in the quiet glow of the tree, their hands intertwined. The world outside faded into the background, and all that remained was the promise of the future they would face together.